our shoot was living inside the crater for a week. We had a volcanologist who was going down there to take a live lava sample from the lake. It was a vent that had started spewing extra lava out, and it was throwing lava bombs within about 200 feet of our camp. And these lava bombs are about the size of a basketball. And so if they'd landed on any one of us, you wouldn't be around to talk about it.
If you could describe the worst day you've ever experienced in your career, or the best day, or both.
I mean, when you do a job like mine, there's so many highlights. It is honestly like you get to go to incredible places, meet incredible people, everything from like Mars scientists to like cave explorers and all these kinds of amazing things. But, I was doing this really great show called One Strange Rock back in 2016, I think, on National Geographic. It was really, we had a healthy budget and, one of these shoots where I said to you before, remember about that jump from producer to director, and everyone finds their own moment to find that jump. And I think the best moment in my career was probably when I had, I guess, what could be best described as a battlefield promotion from producer to director on a shoot. And we were doing this cave shoot in New Mexico. We were basically spending 7 days living 500 meters, like 1,000 feet underground. It took us 7 hours of caving to get to our base camp, and we were squeezing through like tiny holes and like rappelling down like big drops on ropes and all that kind of stuff. And I was the producer on this shoot, and the director was there, and we'd spent months planning it. It was one of those things. I think we mentioned David Attenborough before, and the last time it had been that anyone had been allowed permission to go inside this cave was David Attenborough's crew, because it's a very highly protected cave for a lot of reasons. Anyway, so we were going down, and we had a great team of safety people getting us into the cave, and we were split into 3 groups for safety reasons, and the director I think was in the first group and I was in the last group. Anyway, so I probably arrived to base camp a good like hour or so after the director arrived, and everyone started getting their like camp set up and whatever. Everyone noticed the director was having a real issue, like just a real nervous energy around him, sort of talking really quickly, talking quite erratically. And we thought, oh, it's okay. He's probably just getting used to being underground and all that kind of stuff. And so we probably, I don't know, it took us all day. I left at 8 in the morning or 9 in the morning. And by the time we got to base camp, it was 7 in the evening. It was a full day thing. So we basically just went to bed. Everyone went to bed, and no one could sleep because the director was up and around making coffee and tea, and you're inside a cave, so it's very quiet. Any sort of movement, you get bothered. And he just was not. He was in such an anxious state that he just wasn't able to sleep. And the next morning, the safety guy had basically said, are you okay? And he's like, no, I'm fine. I'll be okay. I'll be okay. And he reminded him of what they told us on the surface, which is this is a cave. Again, it's highly protected, but for every hour that you cave into the cave is a day's worth of rescue. So we did 7 hours in. We were 7 days. If someone had an injury, we were 7 days from rescue. And that is hundreds of rescue cavers getting people out, probably blasting parts of the cave. There's no flat surfaces in a cave. It's not nicely paved, or it's not like a show cave. We're in a wild cave, and there's boulders everywhere and crevasses and places where basically if you take one misstep, you're probably going to injure yourself very badly. And so the team realized this. They spoke to the director and said, look, you haven't slept. You're clearly in a highly anxious state. And essentially he was suffering from a form of claustrophobia, that he sometimes, filmmakers, we find ourselves in these situations where you go into an environment and you've been in many other environments before that are tough and stressful and whatever. And you go, I'll be fine, And sometimes there's rare occasions where you're not fine, and it's hard to predict when and where that's going to happen. And unfortunately for this director, that's what happened. He was underground and just really didn't like it. He later told me about how he just felt the oppressive rock kind of all around him and pressing down on him and all that kind of stuff. And so the decision was made for him to evacuate the cave. It was lucky because I was helping him plan the shoot for months and months in advance. We built the shot list, and I knew all the locations and knew the crew really well. And the responsibility was handed over to me to direct the shoot. And long story short, we went really well. The cameraman and I had a great vibe, luckily, and there was a mutual respect there. And it was basically, let's bring this puppy home and do a really good job of it. And so that was a situation where I got back to the office, and I was it was a really good job, and you delivered a great shoot under really stressful circumstances. And once you've got that one, you've proven yourself once, it's like great. And on that same series, I got to direct like 4 other big shoots on that series because I was now great. Chris has delivered under tough situations, and then once you've got that credit, you're a director, and you've crossed that threshold. Yes, that was a really, really great moment in my career.
Yeah, very cool. A battlefield promotion, I guess.
Yeah.
So, yeah, would you be willing to reveal any time in your career, other than the audio problem, which I don't think was your fault anyway, a time when you might have made a mistake that you had to make up for, or
Yeah. I mean, it's always tough to admit your mistakes, but there was one that I was quite early in my producing days, and we were doing an international shoot, and it was an easy one. It was in New York City, flying from London to New York. We had a crew. We'd filming in scientists' office and labs and stuff. It was an easy shoot, um, and it wasn't my first US shoot, but probably my first shoot in New York. And what happened? We had a great shoot. It was all well, and so we go into the airport, and we get to the airport, and I can't remember whether it was LaGuardia or JFK, whichever it was. Get there, we've got all our equipment. It's probably 5 or 6 of us. We look at the departures board, and I couldn't find the flight. I just couldn't see the flight anywhere on the departures board. And it probably took me a couple of minutes, and then I just looked at the call sheet, where we have our logistics and stuff. And then my heart just sunk because we were in the wrong New York airport. And essentially what had happened was we'd flown into one airport, and I just assumed we were flying out the same airport. We were flying out the opposite airport.
let me guess, you went into JFK and you had to go out of LaGuardia? The same thing happened to me a few weeks ago. I'm not
Really?
kidding. And I didn't know it until that day.
You're an
And,
air traffic
I'm going,
controller,
okay,
Shane.
we're going to go into JFK. And then I'm looking, we got 3 hours for the next flight. And then what this, this is LaGuardia. What the hell? Yeah. We had to take a cab, and
Yep.
he tried to scam us on money. And I'm going, this
Yep.
is nuts. Anyway, go ahead. I'm
I'm
sorry.
I'm so glad I'm not the only one. It makes me feel so much better. But I'm the assistant producer on that kind of role, and it's my job to get all the logistics right. So everyone's worried about, director's worried about the shoot and the rushes, and the cameraman's worried about the kit and whatever. My job is to get people where they need to be, as that in that assistant role. And so I just went, oh, okay, everyone jump in a taxi. We are moving across town, and like looking at my watch, and luckily with a camera crew, you arrive early because you've got tons of equipment and you need time. But I'm like, are we going to make this flight? Are we going to make this flight? And we just made it. We got there, and they were sort of like closing, and they looked at all of our equipment and went, but it wasn't like late enough for them to not let us on the plane. So we got there in the end, but that was probably, it's not a short trip from those 2 airports. And I'm like stuck in traffic, sweating buckets, and it could have gone really wrong, but luckily we didn't miss the flight.
Yeah, I don't know who set up that whole concept over there, but clearly if it's happened to both of us, this must be a pretty common
Yeah,
thing. Wow. Amazing. Well, you made it.
we made it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So let's suppose you won the lottery tomorrow, completely filthy rich, and you never have to work again. Would you still make documentaries?
I think so. I think I would. I got into making documentaries because I believe that makes a tangible change on the world. It's a way of getting I mean, when I started, very early in my days, I don't know if people are aware of this, but the BBC had a great show called Wonders of the Solar System with Professor Brian Cox. And he was a physicist and everything. And this was a really popular show back in the day. And I read a report somewhere, I can't remember where, that once they had released that show, the number of intakes in the sciences, particularly like astronomy and sciences, went up like 9%. After that show came out, and I was like, damn, that is like a tangible impact that you've made on people choosing what to dedicate their life to and choose to study. And I believe that everyone should be curious about the world and study science and all that kind of stuff. So I do think that if I won $100 million, sure, I would have less stress and less pressure because they'd be my films that I can go and make on my own time, because that's where all the pressure comes from, is having deadlines and budgets and financial constraints. But I can make the films that I want to make. And have the freedom to work with who I want to work with, and distribute how I want to distribute, and still try and change the world in that way.
I almost wonder if you would make more money as a result, right? You don't need the money, but now you're able to create and be creative and do some interesting things that budgets might be constraining you to. You might actually end up
It's
with even
possible,
more
yeah.
money. Oh, man, why do I need even more money?
Although sometimes it can be paradoxical, because I've worked on projects where you've got big budgets, and I've worked on projects where you've got small budgets. And actually, when you have shoestring budget, you're forced to really find like the most creative solution. Whereas you got big budget, you're like, oh, we'll just try this and we'll try that, and you don't have to worry so much about being hyper finding the right solution. So it's kind of interesting how less money can actually make you more creative sometimes.
Yeah, maybe your budgets would get completely out of control with the other one, and
Yeah,
screw
I'd
it,
have
just
the money.
bring
Yeah,
in the cocaine, whatever. You
get
know what I
really
mean?
creative. Yeah, get the mushrooms out.
Right. Okay. So you've worked on productions with BBC and National Geographic. How different are those organizations, if at all, in terms of your creative freedom, editorial approach, etc.?
I mean, those channels are, like I say, they all kind of work in a similar way. You know, you've got a commissioner there, you've worked out a budget with them, and your job. The way I like to think about it is that you work with a commissioner to build the boundaries of a sandbox. And once that sandbox is built and you've got your sandbox, as a director of the creative team, or you could be, the exec producer, your job is to be as creative as possible within that sandbox. So I think that's where you understand the parameters and the brief that you've been given and agreed with the channel, and then you just work your magic within that. And sometimes you have to go back to them and go like, hey, we've had this crazy idea, what do you think of this? And they'll be like, yes, I love it, or like, that is an awful idea, don't even go near it. So I think that's how it works kind of broadly. It doesn't matter if it's Nat Geo or BBC or whoever, but I think in terms of their audiences is how they differ. So the BBC, if it's BBC Two, for example, is a very astute audience. They like things that are very factual and very information heavy, still entertainment, and done really well. But if you go to the Nat Geos, the Discoveries, some of those channels, particularly Discovery Channel, their audiences are expecting something different. So you might have
Would you
yeah.
how would you describe their demographics as a different, like if you had to say this is the typical avatar of a watcher of this channel, like how would you describe that person?
I mean, like a BBC Two audience might be, university graduates, professionals in their 30s and 40s and upwards, even higher, that are, well educated, well read. They probably, have good jobs. Not to say that anyone else in other jobs don't have good jobs, but they have, I guess they're expecting a more academic presentation of something. Whereas the demographics for Nat Geo and stuff, they might be a younger audience, they may be a broader audience, and expecting something with a bit more of an entertainment hit. You've got action, you've got drama, big, the editing pacing is faster and all that kind of stuff. So it's just, each channel has their own audience and their own ways of presenting the information, because you can make a space show for BBC or Nat Geo and Discovery, and they could be roughly about the same thing, but the presentation of that show will be completely different on those different channels.
It's interesting. I hadn't thought about that concept. Okay. Very cool. All right. Tell us about difficult or dangerous shoots you might have had. You mentioned the gentleman had the issue in the cave, but anything else that comes to mind that you've had to deal with?
I mean, lots of different things. I mean, there's a couple of small ones. I mean, I did a shoot in Egypt where, certain parts of Egypt, we were basically driving from the north to the south of Egypt with celebrities, with Joseph Fiennes, who people might recognize from like Handmaid's Tale and Shakespeare in Love and stuff. And so we had A-list talent. And when you're driving through certain parts of the country, they can be more or less safe. And we had a security detail with us. There was essentially in the Sinai Peninsula, one of the days we were there was a reports of a bomb, terrorist bomb that had hit a checkpoint. So suddenly we found ourselves with an armored bomb disposal vehicle that was at the front and back of our escort, in front of our convoy. So you kind of feel then, that you're in a spicy environment. And I filmed in minefields recently that, I'm filming literally within touching distance of a landmine. If I reach out my hand, I could pick it up. I didn't, for obvious reasons. Those kind of places, you're always working within very strict safety protocols. So you know what to do and what not to do. But I think in terms of pure drama, and spectacle. And probably the biggest danger in some ways was a shoot that I did in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It was a volcano called Nyiragongo, and we were filming there because this volcano has like a perpetual lava lake, a big, big lava lake that's just always just bubbling away, in the background. You go there, tourists go there and look at it from the crater's edge, and, at nighttime it's orange and glowy and all that kind of stuff. And this crater is huge, it's like, I'm trying to think how many feet, but, like 1,000 feet across and 800 feet deep to get into the crater. And we were going, our shoot was living inside the crater for a week. We had a volcanologist who was going down there to take a live lava sample from the lake. That was our mission. And so we were camping the kind of inside of the craters, like an upside down wedding cake. It's kind of got these terraces that go all the way down to the lake. And we were camping on this terrace that was sort of one layer up from the lava lake. Still a distance, but feel the heat at night and the orange glow. And it was all going well. The second night we were there, we noticed off to the side of the lower tier, there was an orange glow that had started appearing. And we were like, that's interesting. The volcanologist went, we should probably monitor that over the next 24, 48 hours. And we were, and it was getting brighter. And at some point it went from orange glow to spitting orange glow, lava coming out of it. And by sort of day 3 or day 4, I said this was a 6-day shoot, that small little glow had turned essentially into a mini volcano inside the volcano. It was a vent that had started spewing extra lava out, and it was throwing lava bombs within about 200 feet of our camp. And these lava bombs are about the size of a basketball. And so if they landed on any one of us, you wouldn't be around to talk about it. So we essentially had to, I said, you have unpredictable problems on these shoots you've got to solve. And that was something that we thought the safety of the crew is in danger. We've got to evacuate.
Could you hear them landing near you?
Well, the sound of the explosion is basically like a big sort of like the sound of like a small volcano. But the noise of the roar is so loud that it drowns out the sound of any lava bombs hitting. But we would walk in the morning when we could see what was going on, because at nighttime you can't see anything. And we would just see this fresh lava, that is sort of like landed, because it's, very, very black, this fresh lava, compared to the sort of grayer color of the old lava. And so we still had story to shoot. And we were like, we've spent a lot of money getting here. How do we ensure that we leave early to protect ourselves, but also ensure we have enough for the edit to make a story out of it? So we had to do, sort of night before the evacuation, we were like figuring out, okay, great, in the morning, we're going to shoot this, and this. We have to tail off the story, find a conclusion, completely reweave the story, all this kind of stuff. And yeah, so we had to drop a day early, at least a day, maybe a day and a half. And the funniest part of that story is my job as the assistant producer on that shoot, the producer working under the director, was to essentially do a radio check-in with the office every day, for safety reasons. And there was no satellite signal inside the crater. And so I had to climb, like half an hour, like ropes, and getting up to the right to the top of the crater, get the cell phone out, call the office and go, yep, checking in. Crew's all good. This is what we're being up to. Got this in the can. Film this. Blah blah. I'm like, great, no worries. See you at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning for the check-in. And I think on day 3 or something, when it was getting really difficult and everything was so crunched, because we had to get the story in the can before we jumped out, and I had completely forgotten about the check-in. And so 24 hours go by, and I was like, oh, just check in the next day. I get on the phone, and she just screams down the phone at me like, I cannot believe that you didn't check. I thought, because the last time that she's spoken to me, I said, oh yeah, we're all good, but there's a small little vent to the side of the volcano that's spewing a little bit of lava, but we're going to check on it. And so that was the last thing that she heard before radio silence, and I missed my daily check-in. And so she basically thought we'd all been melted by the volcano and was ready to send in the UN helicopter and all that sort of stuff. And so I called her like, hey, just checking in. She was like, I cannot believe you can't believe checking in after 24 hours. I thought you guys were dead and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, she had a real go at me down the phone. But yeah, so we came out all safe and sound, but it was an interesting shoot.
And I'm glad we have a photo to show you of you
Yes.
getting lifted
Yeah.
out. That's fantastic. Okay, so you mentioned working with celebrities like Joseph Fiennes. You had also told me before we did this that you worked with Will Smith. So what is it like working with high-profile talent in these environments, in a production? How does it change the dynamics of the production, other than you said maybe needing extra security. Is there anything else that comes to mind?
Yeah, I mean, working with these big names, they're great for us as the filmmakers because they instantly just draw in connection. They draw in audiences. People want to see what these people are doing. And obviously, you're working with big name talent. Like I said to you before, entourages, you've got a lot more people to wrangle. These people have worked on multi-million-dollar movies. They expect hair and makeup. They have certain expectations. They're not necessarily willing to rough it with the rest of us. There's a 6-day crew in the jungle. They might want a helicopter to take them to and from a hotel. So there's definitely extra logistics that come working with these types of names. But often I find that they're really lovely to work with. They're just humans and they want to do a good job. They know the stakes of doing a good job. There's a lot riding on them. Um, what I find interesting actually is, especially with actors, they're not presenters, they're not documentarians. They're people that are told what to say, when to say it, where to be, and when to be. All that kind of stuff. So when you ask them just to be themselves, it takes them a minute to figure out what that might be. So just like
Wow.
what
Yeah.
what would you want to say to them? Like, well, they have to think about it because they're so used to not having to think about it, and used to
Yeah.
embodying a character. So I often find that they have to think about themselves as a character and what So it's
Yeah.
interesting.
That's really cool. I mean, at the end of the day, I guess we're all sort of characters, right? And
Yeah,
so they have to, so you want the you want the real Will Smith character. Okay, okay, let me think. What do you think Will Smith is? Oh, yeah,
it could take.
interesting.
I mean, again, I wasn't involved in directing Will Smith, and that was people much higher above my pay grades. I think that show had Darren Aronofsky, the visionary author filmmaker from Life of Pi and stuff. So he was an exec producer on the show, so he would come in, and other big name directors would come in and work with Will because there's a skill set to working with some of these folks. And at the same time, that's why those crews are so big. You might have a talent director, a script supervisor, you'd have your science director, all those kinds of things, and producers and stuff. So everyone's kind of like working together with these new, elements to try and ensure that everyone's making something that's good and cohesive.
Okay. You mentioned that making a film is a miracle in itself, with obstacles like contributors dropping out and geopolitical challenges. I don't know if there's still any stories left in you that, but can you tell me a time when everything kind of seemed to fall apart and you solved it?
Oh man, I mean, I guess a few years ago I was doing a show where we were doing shoots in Russia. We had this uh, big shoot we had in Lake Baikal, the deepest lake in the world. It was a great story about the ice in the lake and all that's going to be great. And we planned everything for months and months and months. And then maybe like 3 weeks before we had our shoot planned, Putin and Russia invade Ukraine. And so that we had an American broadcast at the time, and obviously they abide by American sanctions. And America went, well, no one is going to be doing business with Russia. And obviously, how are we going to pay our fixers and our crew and get into the country? And so that was a huge curveball that we had to sort of try and figure out. But we did in the end, but it was tricky. The big one that always comes to mind for me is when I was, I guess, like a mid-level producer, quite experienced, but not crazy experienced. We were doing a shoot flying to Arizona from London. We got to the airport, and again, we have 8 trolleys worth of equipment and luggage and all that kind of stuff. And we start checking it in, and usually I got to go to the front and to the woman, and say, we've got all this equipment. Do you mind if we open another desk or something, and to bother all of your other customers? And they're usually pretty good with that. But we're halfway through checking in our bags. Everything's going smoothly. And then all of a sudden, all of the check-in staff just sort of look at each other and have this look of bewilderment on their face. And essentially what happened, the entire baggaging system, IT system, had crashed. Everything had crashed. And so we were there, and halfway through bagging our tags and stuff, tagging our bags, and we're like, what are we going to do? And she said, okay, just give me a minute. Like, we can still solve this. And so she comes back 10 minutes later, and this is not just our flight. Every single flight in Heathrow Airport, Terminal 5, which, as I'm sure you're aware, that's a big terminal, and a lot of flights going out. And what they resorted to was like, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to tag all your bags, and you're going to put them in a pile in the middle of the terminal. And it was like, wait, but with our flights, we just put them all in the middle of the terminal. They'll all get sorted out. And we were like, are you kidding me? And She was like, no, it'll be fine, it'll be fine. And so we were like, okay, this is going to go wrong. And so the cameraman, we did a big rejig and took all the essential items that we knew we could take onto the aircraft, like lenses and cameras and stuff. And we basically put them in our backpacks. We got on the flight and all kind of a little bit nervous. And this is a 747 flying from, I think it was Heathrow to Phoenix or something like that. And a full 747, it was what, 400 passengers or something like that. I don't know. And we got to the baggage claim at the other end, and a total of 3 bags came out for the entire plane, and none of them were ours. So they basically flew an entire 747 with 3 bags for the entire passengers. And so I'm just in panic mode because we have tripods and lights and all of our other equipment that we couldn't get in our bags and batteries. And we're shooting, like, I think we flew in on a Saturday and we started filming on a Monday. And I was basically like, okay, this is like, again, it comes down to that, like I told you before, this is kind of where I love thriving, where everything is going wrong. And so I went, okay, great, I can solve this. And I just basically took what we had, got to the hotel, and I just jumped on Craigslist. I jumped on eBay. I called rental houses. The next day is a Sunday, so everything is closed, and that made things even more difficult. And I worked with our sound guy, luckily we got our sound guy from Phoenix, so he had a little bit of a local crew network. And we basically spent the entire Sunday driving around Arizona, calling out Craigslist articles. There was a guy who had a wedding, and he's like, I don't need this like tripod and equipment anymore. It's like, great, we'll give you like $50 for it. And then like took that and drove to the next place and drove around town, rattled on doors, woke up people, and we probably scrounged about 80% of the equipment that we had lost for the shoot.
Amazing.
And it was one of those things where at the whole time, I was on the phone because the problem is that that was just like a 3-day shoot, part of a larger US and Canada block. So like 3 days later, we were flying from, I think it was like Phoenix to Colorado for another shoot. So I was like, hopefully, I'm on the phone to the British Airways saying, hopefully our baggage is going to meet us in Colorado because we don't need it to come to Phoenix anymore. By the time it gets there, we'll be gone. And so she's like, okay, don't worry, I'll get it to Denver. It was all good. Don't worry, don't worry. And so we get to Denver and it wasn't there. So I had to do a similar thing again. But I was like, okay, just skip the next stop. Just make sure everything is in Vancouver for the time we get to Vancouver in 5 days' time. And so luckily, by the time I got to Vancouver, it was all there. It was all ready for us. But it was so stressful, just like all the things that I have to do normally, but also scrounging to get stuff. And the only silver lining at the end is that I was on the phone to this woman from British Airways so often, basically every day, like, where's our stuff? Where's our stuff? Is it going to be there? And I think we got to Toronto, which is the last leg of our journey. I said, look, you got to do us some solid here. You got to bump us all to business class or whatever. And she's like, you know what? I know what you guys have been through. And I kept it as a surprise for the crew. And she's like, okay, I'll get you guys upgraded to business for your flight home to London. And so we turned up at the airport and I sort of spoke to the woman and said, yeah, you're all upgraded. And so I handed out the boarding passes and they're like, business class? And I was like, yeah, I managed to get business class for you guys. And it was like one of those end of the shoot euphoria. We'd been on the road for like 2-3 weeks, got into the lounge, and I think the director just like had like some whiskeys and then just had, it was such a great feeling at the end of the flight, being in business class flying home.
Yeah. What an absolute mess. That's crazy.
Oh yeah, it was crazy.
I just can't even imagine at the initial flight on, going out of Heathrow that even the baggage guys must have been like, we're missing an awful lot of bags here, oh,
Yeah.
well.
The woman sent me a photo and she said, and basically what happened, all those bags that people had put in a terminal, they were just shipped to an empty hangar. And I think she told me there was something like 5,000 bags in this hangar. And she showed me a photograph of the hangar and they're all mixed up. Maybe some order to it to some degree, but like I'm not surprised that those bags were, and those poor airport staff that had to like wrangle, and they have obviously their own problems to deal with, but that was crazy.
Absolutely bonkers. All right. How much creative control does a documentary director actually have versus what the broadcaster or the network wants?
Again, it comes down to that sandbox I was describing earlier. The channel has full control. They're the ones paying for it. They have all the rights to do whatever the hell they want with it. They've put their trust in you as the production company to deliver on the brief that they have established. Um, so it's your job to work to the parameters, as in, like, you build that sandbox and you just work within that sandbox to be as creative and build the best sandcastle that you can possibly build. You can't bring in more sand from outside the sandbox asking for more money. Now the channels sometimes, and it's rare, but they sometimes change the brief. They go, we've had second thoughts on this. I know we agreed on it, but like either we don't like this talent or we want someone else, or we've had a change of heart. And then you're in a world of like, okay, well, who's going to pay for the extra shoots or the extra time, like to wrangle this and whatever. So that becomes a little bit more of like, how do we solve this together kind of thing. Because once you're in production, there's no going back. You're already on the road. The train has already left the station, and you've got to build the track as you go along. So yeah, so fundamentally, full control is with the channels and the broadcasters and stuff, but you have full creativity within the boundaries that they've set.
Okay. So Amy was on the show before. She's a science communication writer, and she also interviews scientists, which obviously you do also. She said even Fauci, NASA scientists and such have kind of an imposter syndrome, and it makes, as a result, they're not necessarily comfortable on camera. Have you experienced anything like that with scientists, or how do you get people juiced up, ready to roll?
Well, I guess the difference with it's not just the information that they're conveying, it's the performance and the way that they're delivering that information to the viewers through the camera. So it's everything from like body language to tone of voice to energy levels to the look on their face. It's all those things that we as viewers look at someone and know they're either really nervous or whatever, and that could be distracting and get in the way of the message that they're trying to portray. And obviously, we spend a lot of time trying to cast scientists that we know are going to be strong on camera. So that makes our task a little bit easier. But if there are occasions, of course, when there's just no one else, that's the only person that can speak to that role. I've had times where I've done stuff in Singapore, for example, where I've shot stuff, and not to stereotype Americans, but Americans are usually very expressive and willing to be good on camera. But you go to some other parts of the world, like I say, in Singapore, I was filming this Nat Geo documentary about sort of innovations and technologies going on in Singapore, and I was filming with this engineer, and he'd been given to us as the lead engineer, and the poor guy was so nervous. And I remember they had the press person from the company or from the agency or whatever you want to call it, who was standing behind me, and sort of that press person was very intimidating for this poor guy, and he just couldn't say a sentence. He just couldn't articulate a single complete sentence. And so I said, okay, let's stop, take a break. But basically what happened, I said to the press person, okay, we're going to take a break here. We need to take you outside. So basically the only person that's going to be in this room is me and the cameraman and the talent, the contributor. I'll give you an earpiece to be outside the room so you can listen in. And if you have any notes at the end of my interview, we will review your notes and do pickups. So if you wanted to redo an answer, or you have another question, or you have some issues, we'll do that at the end. Because what she was doing was chiming in after every question, and the poor guy was just falling apart. And so we took a break, and I said, we're going to do this after lunch. So I went for lunch and sat down with this guy, asked him all the questions off camera, and asked him, this is a great answer. This is the way to do it. That was a really great way of presenting it. Maybe, and another one would be like, how about you try and phrase the answer like this? And so when we got back into the interview, it was just the three of us. We'd already built a rapport, which I think is super important for people's comfort levels and that trust. So, you don't just go flash into an interview and shake hands and sit them in the chair and go action, because that person will just, usually freeze up if they're inexperienced. I usually, this guy, we worked out in the end. It was really good, and he was comfortable at the end, and we got some good answers. But always at the interviews I do, I'll sit down with someone, come in. I'll ask them to come in maybe half an hour before we're ready. The camera team are still setting up the lights and they're still busy. And I'll sit down on the sofa, we'll have a coffee or whatever. How you doing? Any questions about the shoot? Any questions about the questions? Any thoughts? Do you want to discuss anything? And I'll just say, it's going to be a very relaxed interview. I'll ask questions. It's not live, so if you want to redo anything, it's super relaxed, don't worry. And just get them in like a really calm space and a comfortable space, and a space where they can trust me. They know that I know what I'm doing, and that they can trust me with the story that they're sharing. And I think that's the number one important thing that the person just feels comfortable with who they're speaking to.
Okay. And another thing that she had talked about was making complex science accessible to general audiences without dumbing it down too much. So I'm curious, how do you strike a balance in a documentary between keeping it accurate, right? Factually accurate from what the scientists are giving you versus making it engaging and understandable for the average viewer?
I mean, for me, we always talk about this is my bread and butter, basically. This is what we talk about, throughout my career is this idea of Trojan science. This all we do is science communication. Trojan science, the idea of like getting a scientific concept packaged in such a way that people don't know they're learning or becoming curious
Sneak
about
attack.
something. Sneak attack, get it in some way that's really entertaining. And just the first example comes to mind. It wasn't even my shoot, but I think it was on a colleague who did it on the same show. They did a physics show, and they kind of asked the question, the old thing, like in a vacuum, what's going to drop faster, a bowling ball or a feather? And they went to NASA, and NASA has their huge vacuum chamber where they test all of their satellites and spacecraft. And they did that experiment. They dropped a feather and a bowling ball at the same time, and they landed exactly the same time. And it was unbelievable to watch it. And so you're building this stunt, and it's something entertaining. People don't know what's going to happen. But at the core of it, there's really interesting principles of physics. So you're delivering them this like piece of fun, entertainment, stunt, or whatever. And then afterwards, you can explain that thing you just saw, this is exactly what's happening. And then you've already grabbed their interest. That Trojan horse is already inside the perimeter of the defenses. And they're like, okay, now I'm hooked. I want to know that weird thing you just showed me. I kind of want to know now what the principle behind that.
Yeah. Very interesting. Okay, so we had Nicole on before. She's a horror writer, novelist, and she talked about creating emotional arcs in stories.
Mm.
So I'm curious, even in documentaries, which is factual, is
Mhm.
there still a goal to create some sort of emotional arc in the storytelling?
Yeah, it really depends, and in the specialist factual kind of realm, like you're not necessarily following a character. You might follow a host or a presenter, but like they're there to deliver information. They're not necessarily emotionally invested. Trying to think of examples, it could be maybe it's an archaeology show and the lead character is an archaeologist and they've got a huge amount invested in their career to get hopefully find whatever they're going to find behind the wall. And then there's the payoff at the end, whether they succeeded or failed. I mean, that's probably as complicated as it gets within specialist factual. The idea that you put a character or a person through a mission or a challenge and they either pass or fail. It's not super complex when it comes to that because that's not necessarily the point. The character isn't the point of the show. The point of the show is to tell you a story about the science or the science of Saturn or some neuroscience concepts or something. So I guess the other example might be on a show like with Joseph Fiennes and Ranulph Fiennes, taking them back to Egypt. So the purpose of that show was to take Ranulph, who's now in his 70s, to recreate an expedition he did when he was like 21. And his cousin Joseph, the actor, was going to rejoin him on this expedition. They're going to start in the start of the Nile and they're going to go all the way to the bottom of Egypt and meet similar characters and go to similar places that Ran had captured in his previous thing. And so you kind of have mapped out the arc of the show in a sense where you're hitting specific beats and you're trying to just ensure that there's a little bit of emotion you're trying to elicit from your main characters as they go through it. You don't have control in the way you do when you're a fiction author, that you have full control to write whatever you want. So the best that you can do in documentaries is to sort of plan a rough arc and then try and direct your talent or put them in situations where you might be able to elicit the emotional response that you want. So you've taken Rand back to an emotional point where something happened on that expedition and trying to hope that he may feel the same things that he felt before. But you can't tell someone they're not actors. These people are not actors. You can't just say, "We need you. Your motivation here is, or your direction here is to cry. I want you to be upset about this memory of how your father did this." You just have to build the arena. I think about them as each of these points along the journey are arenas, and you're allowing your characters to go within that arena that you've built and hope that they experience what you hope that you want them to feel within that moment. You can do a bit of direction, but ultimately they're human beings and they're not actors.
Interesting. Very cool. All right. Let's talk about your podcast, No Ordinary Monday. So I'm curious what inspired you to start it, and what's that like versus obviously making documentaries. And I just want to say for the audience also, I've listened to some of your episodes, and your sound, at the very least, your sound design is way better than anything on this show. So I'm definitely gelling on that. But why don't you talk about it?
Yeah, sure. So I've been making docs for 15 years, and I've met so many fascinating people throughout that time. It doesn't matter whether they're on camera or off camera. On camera, like Mars scientists, people that drive the Mars rover, and like off camera, like the safety crews that are like these crazy adventure men that like set the ropes up for all of our volcano shoots and our like cave shoots and stuff. And like doesn't matter if they're on camera, off camera. Like we'd film the thing, and if we're filming someone like a neuroscientist or whatever, they're not necessarily talking about themselves. They're talking about their expertise and delivering that information. But we would go for dinner with them after the shoot and, have a beer, have a drink, again, well, the off crews, and just have the most fascinating conversations. And you're like, you are such an interesting person, and your story and the way you got into this job and what you're doing with it and how it makes you feel. Like all that stuff for me was sometimes lost. And it's pure the nature of the documentary because they're not there to capture that stuff. But across my career, I just have all these conversations with people and like, it'd be so cool to share these stories. And so now, kind of combined what we were talking about earlier with the changing shift of the documentary landscape and the changing habits and consumption habits of the consumers, I thought now is a cool time to sort of really turn this into something that I think people would enjoy as a concept. And so I came up with the idea of No Ordinary Monday. These people that have doesn't they don't need to be unusual jobs, but sometimes they are, but just extraordinary experiences within those jobs. And so, yeah, I started with low hanging fruit, all the people I knew within my network that had these stories, and a bunch of the earlier episodes are those people. And now I'm kind of a couple of months into it, and just going out there and finding people that share the same concept of having a really cool job and great stories. So I think that the two things I love about it are one, that it's built for people that they don't need to be interested in anything else apart from hearing a great story. No, it's just entertainment. It's someone who is a great storyteller and got a great story to share. And that appeals to most people, especially in the day of AI and all this false stuff. It's real humans, real stories, real experiences. But there's a secondary element I like to it as well, which is it's kind of for people like myself who are in early parts of their career who maybe didn't know what they wanted to do, or maybe people in the mid part of their career that are still like, I've been in this job that I hate for so long, and maybe this is my last chance to jump at something that I really want to do. And so for those people, like they could jump onto the podcast and get a really deep behind the scenes look at what that job is like, what that person has experienced throughout their career and get a really sort of deep sense of it's that little nudge, that little sort of push that they needed that little like spark of inspiration to take the leap and try a job that they've always wanted to try and never had the chance.
Yeah. Well, I'm just glad you didn't name it Tales from the Shift, because then I would have had to come up with it.
Yeah, we're not far. I think I'm like 2 months ahead of you. We launched pretty much close to the same time.
Yeah, yeah, definitely some similar crossings there. Very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, people should definitely check it out. All right, let's bring it home. How about what's a secret that most people might not know about documentary filmmaking that you haven't already revealed for us today?
Yeah, I mean, I think people are always surprised by the cost and the time it takes to make a 1 hour documentary on Nat Geo. It's probably costs a lot more than you think and takes a lot longer than you think. But I think the thing that sort of resonates with me is that, and I don't know whether people realize this, I certainly watch it. There's a certain X factor to a film or a documentary when everything is humming beautifully. It's like a well-oiled engine. Like the people are working together just marvelous. Like the love and the passion is just there. I've watched films where you can really get a sense of like, okay, everything is just falling into place beautifully. Like the director knew that we were doing, the cameraman knew exactly what they were doing. Great direction from the director, the editor really got the brief, and every single step of the way is just nailed. And apologies to your audience, I'm just full of metaphors today, and people may not like it, but the way I always imagine it is that when you start a production, it's like holding a handful of sand, like a big handful of sand. And your job is to try and retain as much of that sand in your hand as long as possible towards the end. But it's super hard to keep it. So you lose your sort of things fray a little bit, and your fingers fall apart. Things are a little bit loose, and you start losing some of those sand grains. And I think those are the sort of things when you watch a film and you realize there were struggles in the development or struggles with the finances, and maybe the cameraman and the didn't quite get the brief, and the editing wasn't quite right. It just hasn't got that sort of like flow. But there's every so often where you watch a documentary and you just know that every single aspect of it was nailed. And that's what I love. And people may not realize it, but I think that's something that I notice sometimes about watching these films.
Excellent. Excellent. All right, Chris. I really appreciate you taking time out from your evening, and it's been awesome. Thank you for
My
coming on.
pleasure, Shane. It's a real honor to be on the show. Thank you so much for inviting me.
You bet. That was Chris Barron, documentary filmmaker. Hope you learned a lot about the documentary filmmaking process. I sure did. And if you like that content, please give a like, maybe a subscribe, a little comment down below, maybe click another video in the chain. And if you have an interesting job or career you'd like to be on the show, then email me at talesfromtheshippodcast@gmail.com.